Hi, I'm Pete and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. This video is the second part of replacing my Farmall H's magneto with a distributor. In the first part I disassembled the distributor, cleaned it up, evaluated it, and got it ready for paint. In this video I'm going to paint the parts, reassemble the distributor, mount it on the tractor, wire it to the tractor, and hopefully get the tractor running, so stay tuned. I'm going to partially assemble the distributor before I paint everything. That way there's less chance of damaging the paint during assembly. First I put the gasket and cover on the drive housing. I suspect this distributor came from a 100 series or later tractor that had a tachometer. That's what would have mounted where the cover plate is. I used some engine assembly grease to lubricate the distributor shaft and put on the thrust washer and install the shaft. Then I slide the thrust washer and drive gear on the other end. The drive gear is held on with a pin. I align the gear and drive in the pin. I set the pin with a punch to lock it in place. Now I can assemble the Spark Advance parts in the distributor. I use some motor oil on a paintbrush to lubricate the areas where the weights rub against the distributor housing and the pins that the weights ride on. A magnetic screwdriver is a big help for getting the governor weight guard screws started, otherwise they just drop into the housing and rattle around. I thread a grease zerk in and lubricate the distributor bushing and shaft. This is a porous bushing. I think they're called an oil light bushing. The grease actually permeates through the bushing and lubricates the shaft. So when the grease squirts out of the pinhole on the other side of the housing, you're good to go. That means it's been filled with grease. Then the zerk gets removed and a pipe plug gets installed. Next comes the breaker plate. I'm leaving the cap hold down clamps off so I can paint them separately. I install the terminal that connects the coil wire to the points and condenser. I'm almost ready to paint the parts. I just have to mask off the mounting surfaces that I don't want painted. I also bought a new 2-pole ignition switch, and the stem of that gets masked. I wipe everything down with lacquer thinner to clean off any oil remaining on the surfaces. Then it's time to prime and paint the pieces. For little jobs like this I use spray can paint. It's just too much trouble to mix up paint for a few parts. When I'm painting a whole tractor I'll use an HVLP spray gun and mix my own paint. I let the paint harden for 48 hours, then remove the tape from the mast areas and do the rest of the reassembly. I bought a new cap, rotor, points, coil, and condenser at Napa. I found their Eklund brand electrical parts to be more reliable than the cheapies you can get elsewhere. First the cap hold downs go on. I install the condenser in the points. I set the points gap to 20 thousandths per spec. I put on the breaker cover and gasket. I turn the rotor until it is in the number 1 cylinder firing position, and I can tell when it's there by putting the cap on a line. There's a notch to properly align the cap, and then comparing where the rotor is to where the number 1 plug tower is. So I get them aligned as best I can, and then I install the cap. Now it's time to get everything installed onto the H. First I remove the spark plug so I can turn the engine by hand to the correct timing position. Then I remove the magneto. Next, I install the distributor drive shaft and drive housing. Now I've got to get the engine on number 1 top dead center of the compression stroke before I can put the distributor on. And a viewer let me know a handy little tip: instead of stuffing tape in the hole and waiting for air to hiss out, I can just put the number 1 spark plug in loose and then listen for air hissing out of that. Loose spark plug, we'll turn her over. I hear air. Here comes the timing pointer. There we are on the first mark on the crankshaft. Now I set the distributor when I put it together to be on number 1 spark plug firing, and we'll just check it. Spin it around. You can hear the points click when they open and close. Number 1 lines up right there. Doesn't have to be exact because we can turn it after we get it on. As the engine's running, we can do the timing that way exactly. Oh, got to get the gasket. Gasket on here. Some lube on the gear. Put the clamps on, leave them loose so we can turn it later on to fine-tune the timing. I'm just going to tighten them down a little bit so I don't mess it up when I'm putting on the coil and such. That'll keep it from turning. I'll put the coil on next. This is a 12 volt, no external resistor required. You want 6 volts running across the points, and I have a choice of either running a 6 volt coil with a resistor on the outside, a ballast resistor, or I can run a 12 volt coil with an internal resistor. I think that's cleaner. I have a 12 volt system on this tractor. If I had a 6 volt system, I could just run a 6 volt coil, but since I got 12 volt, I've got to drop it down to 6 volts at the points. We need to grab 12 volt battery power to power the coil. I'm going to have to run a wire to it. So we're going to open up the switch box and figure out where we can connect 12 volt hot to. So from inside the switch box here, all these wires are connected to the hot post on the voltmeter, and then this is the ground post of the voltmeter, which is connected to ground. So I can pull power for the coil off this hot terminal here. I'll run it down, and I'm going to put in a new switch in line to the coil to power the coil. Now I can't use this old switch because it's a 1-pole switch, and all this switch does is it runs from the ground up on the magneto, and when you push in the switch, it grounds the magneto. There's just one wire running into the back of it, and it grounds it against the frame here and kills the magneto. But for a distributor, I need a 2-pole switch like this, because this switch acts to make the circuit to the coil. So when this switch is out, like now, I've got power running from the battery through to the coil, and the tractor runs. When I kill it, it breaks the circuit and the coil's got no more power, so it quits. So I have to change out the switch. So what I did is I got a length of new wire, I hooked it up to the hot post on the voltmeter, and I kind of cobbled it. This is a crimp-on fitting I put on. I put electrical tape on it. Usually I use heat shrink connectors. I like those. They're nice and clean and professional looking. But I ran out, so that's what I'm using. So we're going to run this wire down to 1 pole of the switch, and I can close this back up now because we're done in here. And of course I'm using red wire. What other color is there besides red? For the hot wire from the switch up to the coil, we're going to use the same wire that was the kill wire for the magneto. And this tractor's negative ground. It's not like most old Farmalls that were positive ground. When I changed it over 12 volts, I made it negative ground. So the juice from the battery goes to the positive terminal of the coil. I made a little wire here, and it goes from the negative side of the coil to the points in the condenser inside the distributor. I don't like these connections. This electrical tape always comes loose over time, and I'll probably go back and do it the right way. Usually I put these on, I solder them in place, and then I put heat shrink tape on them. I got a new set of plug wires. I'll tell you, if you go to the cheapo stores like Tractor Supply, you get these crappy do-it-yourself wires, and they have aluminum core cables on them, and it's worth it to pay the extra money for copper core wires that are made to length already. The connections are just so much better than the do-it-yourself ones. We'll start with the coil wire and put them on. Firing order 1342. 1342. 1. 3 is a shorty. These even have a dab of silicone in them to seal them up after you put them on. I like it. 3, 4, and 2. Beautiful. Almost forgot I got to pump some grease into this gear housing. I put some engine assembly lube on it, but it really should have some grease. You remember how much we pulled out of there? There was a ton of old grease. Let's turn her over and see if she runs. By rotating the distributor back and forth a little bit, see if it sounds any better that way. Starting to miss there. Back. magneto. And we're clickety-clack of the magneto impulse coupling when you shut her down. I don't have a timing light. That's on my wish list, I guess. So I just time these by ear, and it's close enough for me. One of the ways you can tell if the timing's off is the tractor starts to run hot. That means the timing's probably retarded a little bit too far. And I just listen by ear for the smoothest engine with the least misses. And there you have it. H distributor renovation from start to finish. Tractor runs probably better than she ever has since I had that old magneto on it anyway. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.